All right, let's get started. Um, one hallmark of a liberal arts approach to uh, education is working with the great books, the great books of our civilization, which contain so much of our heritage and our the achievements and so much that is true and good and beautiful. And just traditionally, those have been some of the, we talk about going ad fontes, to go to the sources. These are some of the sources of so much that we have. And so studying great books has been a hallmark of a classical approach to education. Another one is tying things together, whereas most progressive education is highly specialized and you study a lot of subjects, but they have no relation to each other. A classical approach tries to relate them. And so another trait of a liberal arts approach has been to try to integrate subjects so that you're studying literature and history and the theology of the time and the philosophy and how things change and worldviews developed. And so integrating the curriculum has been another hallmark. But that's hard to do. Very few of us teachers or homeschooling parents have had that kind of education ourselves. And it's fine, we could read the great books, but some of us don't feel that we know enough to really do justice to them, and especially to tie them into the other strains of their civilization that we're trying to study. So that's a challenge for classical Lutheran educators, a lot of them, or most of them, I would dare say. But Veritas Press has come up with a solution to that. It's called the Omnibus curriculum, and what it is an integrated humanities program built around the great books. But not only that, it gives what you need to know to understand the great books and to teach them and to tie them in together with the other things going on. So you're learning about history and philosophy and literature and the arts and music and the thought of the different times in our civilization. And it works with homeschool because it can be very self-contained. A student can sit down with the curriculum and master it with very little input from the parents, although there's material to help parents to help the students go along. And in a classroom, it's built. There's teachers' guides. There's online material. There's videos. There's everything you can imagine. Again, you can find Omnibus courses online for homeschoolers. My daughter Joanna has taught in that format, and Classical Conversations and some of the others who will do omnibus programs, and they're good for classrooms and Lutheran schools. So, I mean, the issue with it's really good. It really gives a comprehensive curriculum. It's built for the grades 7 through 12, junior high and high school ages. Now, Veritas Press, that put this out, is a Reformed publisher. Not just Reformed, we Lutherans classify all Protestants except us as Reformed. Specifically, it's a confessional Calvinist publishing company, just like CPH is a confessional Lutheran publishing company. And so their perspective comes through on some of the material. What I want to do today is talk about how to approach this as Lutherans, how we can swap out some of the things. But again, notice it's confessional Calvinist. It's not generic evangelical. You won't find decision theology. There's one concern Lutherans have. It's creationist. It's holds to the inerrancy of Scripture, and it holds to justification by grace through faith, and so much that we would appreciate. But again, it has the Calvinist elements. You know, you'll find double predestination and limited atonement and kind of a rationalist spirit sometimes, and as well as kind of a moralistic, you know, more focus on the law maybe than the gospel, although the gospel is there and affirmed. So I want to talk about the curriculum and how to Lutheranize it, to make up a verb. Maybe that's a good verb for us to have. Okay, let me explain how it works, how it's organized, and what it contains, and then I'll talk about how to tinker with it a little bit. It's built around 6 volumes. These are big, beautiful books. Let me pass these around too, with illustrations and all kinds of good things. The volumes, there's a volume for the ancients, a volume for medieval, which include the medieval and the Renaissance and the Reformation periods. And then there's a volume on the modern, which really begins with the 1700s, with the Enlightenment, into the 19th century Romanticism, and on into our current times. And there's those 3 periods are repeated. 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, so you get it on the junior high level, and then again on the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Again, you go back to the ancients, back to the medieval, back to the modern, where you're reading more challenging material at a higher level, and you're getting it again on the high school level. So you have these books, and then they have what they call primary books and secondary books. The primary texts are the main great books that you're studying. These are the great books that have been just historically so significant and important. And so you have the primary books, and then the secondary books are also kind of about the great books. It does more with, I think the primary ones do a lot with kind of the history of the time and the thought of the time, the culture of the time. The secondary books go into that a little more. There's more emphasis on literature and on theology, and even on modern reflections or books that are about that period or draw on that period. And so primary and secondary, that has nothing to do with primary grades or secondary education. I think we could have found some better terminology. But these are texts, they're bundles of books. Veritas will sell them to you all together, or you can get them from, if you're homeschooling, from the library, or a lot of them, if you're using Kindle, they're free online to download. So anyway, so there are these two kind of collections of books, and then these books have essays that address all of those works. And so either the teacher or the student or both can read the introductions and discussions of the particular work. Then afterwards are sessions that actually give study questions, assignments, activities, discussion topics, assignments, and it just has about everything you need to really cover these works at a pretty high level. So that's the Omnibus program. Now, when we talk about Lutheranizing these, first of all, whatever you're studying, you're not going to just be reading material by Lutherans, right? In a regular class, especially in an English-speaking context in America, the Lutheran writers are not as prominent as they would be if you were studying in Germany, or even more so if you're studying in Denmark or Norway or Sweden. Lutheranism has a much bigger presence in those societies than it does in England and America. And I don't think Lutherans need fear even being exposed to other churches or other theologies. For me, when I read other Christian books, it just makes me glad I'm a Lutheran. Because to me, the weaknesses of so many of these stand out, and what we have in Lutheranism is so refreshing, comparatively speaking. But we're practicing Lutheran education, classical Lutheran education. So if we're using this program to teach theology, we want it to teach Lutheran theology, right? But there's another point that you need to understand. We often think of the different churches or different theologies as well. You know, here's one, here's another, here's Lutheran, there's Calvinist, there's the Catholics, there's the Orthodox, and there's all these different kinds of Christianity. And you know, we're right, the others are wrong, and so we'll just focus on this little narrow area. But I love that quote from C.F.W. Walther, no less, who said, "The evangelical Lutheran Church is the true visible church of God on earth." Just an incredible statement, and a lot of other churches make fun of that. Oh yes, here he was, this little immigrant church, just a few congregations. They're the true visible church of God on earth. And he's implying that they're the only, Lutherans think you're the only church. No, that's not it at all. The point of that quote is that our Lutheran theology is not just one theology among many. What we have is the historic church. That you go to the church fathers, the core of Christianity built around the Word of God and the gospel and work of Christ. That is the church, and you can find that throughout, or much of that throughout the church. The problem is churches often go astray from it, or they leave things out, or they add things that shouldn't have been added. But that core Christianity, that's ours. I mean, that's us. So Lutherans, we can appreciate the church fathers, We can, Augustine is one of the great books studied in Omnibus. The Middle Ages, when we read the King Arthur stories by Mallory, just how much he does with baptism and the Holy Communion. Okay, we can appreciate that. That resonates with us as Lutherans. Now, and yet at the same time, when we study the Middle Ages, those writers, the papacy, the obscuring the gospel, we pick up on that, and we see the errors of that and the sadness of it. But when you read Chaucer and Dante, Chaucer has some hilarious satires against the sellers of indulgences. Okay, that didn't just happen in 1570 with Luther. Already Chaucer was making fun of the pardoner in some hilarious satire. Dante was doing the same thing, criticizing the papacy of his day. And as Lutherans, we can pick up on that. And there are things in Dante, he talks about purgatory, which we reject. But of course, his work is an allegory. It's symbolic. The hell is not a description of what hell actually is. He's symbolizing sin. And it helps us see what sin is and why certain things are sinful as rejections of the love of God and love of neighbor. This purgatory is a symbol of overcoming sin. That's what he does with the punishments. At the same time, we can pick up, here are people in purgatory for thousands of years. And people felt that they couldn't get to heaven until they paid by living in punishment for thousands of years before they could be purged of their sin. And it's again, our Lutheranism, you can see the context of what Luther was speaking to and the greatness of the gospel that he was addressing. Anyway, the same thing. You can read Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress. Bunyan became a Christian by reading Luther's commentary on Galatians, whether it was read to him and he heard it. And there's some great distinction between law and gospel in Pilgrim's Progress. It's just when the character is trying to climb Mount Sinai, which he describes as a volcano blowing up, and it gets steeper and steeper the higher you go. And then Moses comes along and just beats him up. He just beats him. And great picture of the law. You face up to it. We need to get beaten up by the law. But then as a prelude that leading then to the cross. So we can appreciate much in Bunyan, but again, we see the limitations of a 17th century Puritanism at the same time. And so the point is, everything that's good and true and beautiful in the historic church, we Lutherans can claim that as our own. And what we have to do as Lutherans in working with material like that is to add what is missing. Okay, some miss the word. Some miss the sacraments. Bunyan and the Calvinist student will know with the sacraments, so they don't know how to get. They may be good on the grace of God, but not how we receive the grace of God. And rejecting this or just ignoring the sacraments. And then you have others who have a strong view of sacraments, but don't have a good handle on the gospel. So part of Lutheranizing something, whether it's Omnibus or anything else you're teaching, is what's missing. And again, that implies that there is going to be something there of value, very likely, but then it's missing something. What's missing? And then add that. And then, what are the flat-out errors that we need to correct? Okay. So in Omnibus, where do the problems lie? It's not so much in the great books, not so much in the primary text, even as in their packaging of them. These, everybody would admit, these are the important texts of our civilization. Even non-Christians would have to say, yeah, these are the really important ones. And we believe in the doctrine of two kingdoms, so we can see in cultural issues, again, God is reigning in a secret way, and he's reigning in the realm of the so-called secular realm also. There's not a lot of conflict there in the great books. In the Calvinism in Omnibus comes in some of the supplementary material. It comes in some of the secondary books, that selection. My daughter, Joanna, who has taught at the Omnibus course for Veritas Press, actually, I believe at one point, she says the biggest place where you have the Calvinist influence come down is in the teacher's guides, especially when it gives the answers to the questions. Okay. Now, the sessions will have essays and students will answer them. Well, when you look them up, the answers suggested, the teacher's guide, there you'll find a lot of Calvinism. But I think the student is kind of insulated from those. And as teachers, I hope you grade using your own judgment, not just following the answers given in the teacher's guide, especially for discussion type questions. And I'm confident that you can recognize, good, solid answers and give credit for those. But let me talk about this in more detail. Okay, in the handout, I give the list of works covered in Omnibus. This is Omni Volume 1, and notice it gives the primary text, and it gives the secondary. If you're teaching Omnibus in a school, you're going to have, actually, they're primary and secondary are two separate classes. And like in the 7th grade, first semester, you may do the primary ones. Second semester, may do the secondary ones. And then it works forward. So what I've done in this handout, the red are either Lutheran works or chapters that were written by Lutherans. So I don't think you'll have much problem with them. And sometimes I switch out Calvinist writings and substitute them with Lutheran writings. Okay. Most of the Lutheran writings I suggest, and obviously you can do your own different ways of doing it, have study guides that are online. So if you need to find something somewhat like the sessions, if you want something for students to respond to, questions to answer and the like, you can look those up and find them online in most of the cases. Now, you have volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. Now, when Omnibus got the first 3 volumes and they're ready to start on the high school curriculum, they actually asked me to be one of the editors. I think not because I'm a Lutheran, but because I've got some knowledge about how to do the great books and how to do the liberal arts stuff from a Christian perspective. But anyway, you will notice that on the high school levels, volume 4, volume 5, and volume 6, there's a lot more Lutheran influence. And some of that is because I ask other Lutheran teachers and scholars to write the essays. So some of those, Virgil's Eclogues and Georgics, Joanna Hensley, J.A., that's my daughter, who some of you might know and teaches in this context. Let me just walk through this and just comment on the different volumes and what I've done here, how to Lutheranize them. Again, Volume 1, the ancient. They also work in the Bible as part of the subjects they're trying to integrate. So you'll have 1st and 2nd Kings, Luke and Acts. Again, good to read. But again, you'd probably want to use Lutheran commentaries to help make sure there's a Lutheran perspective on those. The secondary, Volume 1, you have, the best things in life, and Unaborted Socrates. These are by Peter Kreeft. He's a Catholic writer. These books are kind of very popular, accessible applications of Socrates mainly, and some of the ideas of him about the examined life and things like that. And they're good, there's fine, there's nothing wrong with them. The Unaborted Socrates basically brings Socrates to bear on pro-life issues. Very important today as we teach young people to stand up for life and in these, especially in these times. Now, usually the non-Calvinist works that Veritas puts in here, if they don't threaten Calvinism, they're probably not going to threaten Lutheranism. Okay, so most of the ones, they do things with C.S. Lewis. And again, C.S. Lewis is not a Lutheran. He's weak on justification. But what he writes and the works that he writes are very, very good. He may be weak on justification, but you'll find, as David Scayer quoted about Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it gets the atonement, the substitutionary atonement, very well in a way that everybody, including young children, can really imagine it, that Christ is our substitute and he took our penalty. Okay, he's an Anglican, but still very much worth reading for lots of reasons. So kind of general books like that, I think you can deal with and won't be much of a problem. Okay, Chosen by God. Here, Ancient Secondary has 2 books by R.C. Sproul. The Chosen by God's about predestination. The Holiness of God. It's very reformed. It's actually a good book. Before I was a Lutheran, reading that book kind of was maybe one of the stages that helped bring me to Lutheranism. To think of God as not just somebody I was making in my own image, but what the holiness of God means. I think I've learned it better as a Lutheran, but it's not going to hurt your children, I don't think, to read that very much, except he does take a Reformed perspective, and everything is to the glory of God, and you know how that goes. Why not replace that with a Lutheran book on holiness? A good one is by Harold Sinkbeil, Sanctification, Christ in Action, where he also kind of addresses a lot of the evangelical ideas that are in the air and counters those. I put another Sinkbeil book for Chosen by God, just 2 R.C. Sproul, 2 Sinkbeil books, Dying to Live. That gives a kind of a Lutheran view of the Christian faith and the Christian life. You go to Volume 2, In the primary books, they include Luther. Here's one by Luther. The Bondage of the Will. Now, of course, Calvinists love the bondage of the will. And although they love Luther, but they tend to misunderstand him and get him only partially right. But bondage of the will, election, predestination. Okay, but it's by Luther, and it's very much worth reading. I think that may be a little young age to handle it. It's a good tonic, though, for us to read in our Lutheran classical schools, because it's a tonic against the tendency of some classical educators, some classical schools, to be humanistic. And actually, when you read a lot of the other books on classical education from a more secular view, they're humanistic. They believe that classical education is enough to make virtuous human beings, to fulfill the human spirit and all the other things. And that's a danger, frankly. And we have to be careful about that. In Luther's day, this was written against Erasmus, the great Renaissance scholar. And he did things to contribute to the Reformation, like translate or edit the Greek New Testament and make that available, which Luther used in his translation into the vernacular. But that developed into humanism. And so Bondage of the Will, this work, Luther, it's this great debate with Erasmus, and we still need that. Anyway, so that's part of it. Other things you read in that one, the Confessions by St. Augustine, wonderful book about his conversion in ancient Rome. Again, the Divine Comedy, on the Incarnation of our Lord by Athanasius. Again, great Athanasian Creed material that we confess in our theology. Rule of St. Benedict, it's about monasticism, which is Lutheran we have to correct. But again, this is kind of part of the context of Lutheranism. Luther was a monk, and it will teach us about that, as well as a number of just good works. Medieval secondary. Again, you have a lot of modern works. Tolkien, Fellowship of the Ring, The Hobbit. Now, he's not from the Middle Ages, but he does, in some ways, kind of convey the literature and the imagination and even the worldview, in many ways, of the Middle Ages. And this is kind of supplementary. You go to Omnibus Volume 3, the modern. Again, here's, it's so easy. The Westminster Confession of Faith. Okay, that's easy to switch out to the Augsburg Confession and Apology. If our students read that, it's much superior. In the secondary, biography of Charles Finney, 19th century evangelist. It's instructive, especially to see how he's manipulating people. And that may be why he wasn't a Calvinist, I don't believe. That may be why they included it as kind of a critique of revivalism. But I think you could, if you want to do a biography, there are many others that you could use, like many biographies of Luther. I list one put up by CPH. It's on a kind of a middle school level, I would say. Christianity and Liberalism, that's by J. Gresham Machen, who was Reformed faculty of Princeton. And this is kind of the beginning of fundamentalism in what happened at Princeton, because liberal theology had taken over, very much like our Seminex experience much later. And then modern writing about historic Christianity. And it's a great criticism, a great critique of liberal theology. The idea that we have to change Christianity to fit the dominant ideas of our time. Okay, and the liberal theology changes as the dominant ideas keep changing, but it's the same principle. And it's very much worth reading, even though he is Reformed, even though he's not Lutheran. How should we then live? Francis Schaeffer. That book itself helps us to see the different changes away from the biblical worldview to ones that would come. And Schaeffer, he's Reformed, not Lutheran, but he does a really good critique of contemporary culture from a Christian perspective. And he did a lot with that book to bring evangelicals into the pro-life movement. Originally, a lot of the evangelicals, including Southern Baptists, were pro-abortion and passed resolutions supporting abortion, supporting Roe versus Wade. But then Francis Schaeffer came on and really here and in his other writings, he was a big factor in awakening evangelicals to the evils of abortion and the other anti-life things that are going on and still are. New Fox's Book of Martyrs, that's a good one. It contains a lot of what happened to the Lutheran martyrs. A lot of these martyrs were Lutheran and how they gave their lives for testifying to the gospel. Oh, there's Postmodern Times by me. This is before I was involved with it. They listed me. It makes me feel good to be among the great books. I don't think that's a great book. I think it's a pretty good book. Now, after you say the great books, you can then have more classes on good books and pretty good books. Anyway, I'm flattered to be included there, but there's a chapter in that volume 3 on my book with exercises to do. So Omnibus 4, this is when I got involved as an editor. Again, much of the assignments were already done. The editors, we would meet and figure out who can we get to write about this author or this topic. And then a lot of us editors wrote things. Again, Joanna wrote a wonderful introductory and discussion of Virgil's Eclogues. I wrote one on Aristotle's Poetics, GEV, that's me. Oh, another thing, the high school books, now the ones I'm passed around are the high school books that I was involved with. They also have essays on topics, on disciplines. For high school kids, that when they go off to college, the different majors they might take and the different professions they might pursue. Giving a kind of Christian perspective, here are the issues in these fields, here's what you need to know, here's how to navigate this as a Christian. I wrote the essay on aesthetics, got John Warwick Montgomery, Lutheran, to write the one about law. Very good essay. There's a wonderful one on mathematics, not written by a Lutheran, but the one on mathematics was really illuminating for me because, we talk about intelligent design. It raises the fact that mathematics, it's a mental exercise that actually corresponds to the outside world. And how is that? how is it something that's purely a mental construction? How is it that you can use that to calculate things and, fly spacecraft to the moon and apply them to physics and chemistry and every other way? And of course, the point is that math works is evidence of a mind behind the creation. It's not just one little thing or a few little things here, intelligent design. It's the fact that mathematics exists and mathematics works. That's a powerful evidence for God's creation. Anyway, there's a lot of good essays like that. I just mentioned these two because they were by Lutherans. Omnibus, Volume 4, Secondary. Again, there was one, Art in the Bible, by Francis Schaeffer, and I wrote the essay about that and getting into the topic. Desiring God by John Piper, actually a pretty good book about desiring God and why we can yearn for Him and the pleasure that knowing Him brings. But again, he's a prominent Calvinist preacher today. I was bold enough to substitute my book, Spirituality of the Cross, not because it necessarily on the same subject, but I think that I wrote it in a way that I think would be good for high school kids to read, and I had to put it somewhere, so I switched myself out with John Piper. But you could obviously just add it or replace it for something else. Another book that I think is really good for Lutheran lay people, including Lutheran young people, to know is John Kleinig's Grace Upon Grace. It just vividly, in such an exciting way, sketches out really the Christian life and the Christian devotional life and what that can mean and what it can do. Just a wonderful book. It's so well written and so thrilling. Knowing God by J.I. Packer. Again, that book is good to read. He's an Anglican evangelical, and it's kind of apologetic in nature. Again, fine to read, but anyway, getting John Klein again there is even better. Okay, on the Volume 5. Again, I wrote the introduction, the material for Canterbury Tales. My daughter wrote about Consolation of Philosophy, Joanna Hensley. A really good essay. She talks about how the quadrivium, according to the author, Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius, mathematics is number, geometry is number in space, music is number in space and time. Let's see. Yeah, and astronomy, music is number in time, that's it. And astronomy is number in space and time. It really gives you a good way to fit the quadrivium into your classical liberal arts paradigm. Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas, shows you medieval scholasticism. I think it's good for Lutherans to know that and to have sampled it, and that's all it gives here. But Martin Luther, again, is in the primary great books. Use a book selection from his writings. They do The Freedom of the Christian and many other of his really good works. Calvin's Institutes, well, it's actually kind of worth reading, but I suggest swapping it out for the Formula of Concord. giving more or less a kind of a systematic approach to our Lutheran confessional positions. Okay, secondary, George Herbert, English poems, my favorite poet, great Christian poet. I wrote the material for that. Switch out the Heidelberg Catechism for, guess what? The large catechism. Easy and much superior. Another of the great secondary works is Here I Stand, Roland Bainton's biography of Luther. And it really is maybe the best biography of Luther, the best one to recommend to people, because it's so readable, so well written. Bainton was not a Lutheran, but he really has a good biography of Luther. It's just a masterpiece of the art of biography. If you want to see a biography that's really done well, everybody points to Here I Stand, the biography of Luther. There's a lot of Luther he quotes in it, and it gives you a really good introduction to him. Yeah, the modern primary, All Quiet on the Western Front. I wrote that very moving book about war, about World War I from the German perspective. Emma by Jane Austen. Joanna wrote, being a Jane Austen fan, I enjoyed writing the material for Emma. She also wrote Origin and Principles of American Revolution. That was a 19th century book by, I forget who, a European, looking at the differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And it's really very quite instructive. Paradise Lost, my favorites, great epic. Another way to study the great books is to look at the great epics, and to just build a course around the great epics. And this is the incredible Christian Protestant biblical epic that's unmatched by anything else in English literature. Pensées, I wrote that one. He was he was Catholic, but he was a Jansenist, which meant the Jansenists were accused of the Lutheran heresy. And the Jansenists were eventually stamped out by the Roman Catholic Church. But Lutherans will find Pascal very, very compatible. And this is one of the great apologetic works ever. And I think some very different kinds of perspectives and angles. And it's a neglected masterpiece of Christian thinking, and needs to be known more than it is today. The secondary modern collected poems of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot was a great modernist poet who's very radical and very find new ways of writing poetry, and some say did great damage to modern poetry. But then he became a Christian, and a conservative Christian. And his Christian verse is better than his non-Christian verse. Again, another great ally for Christians that many Christians can completely know nothing about. Hamlet, I'm not sure why that is in the modern secondary, but great work of Shakespeare. My daughter Joanna Hensley wrote that. She also wrote about the jungle. That's the one about the social realistic novel about the food industry that if you have a tender stomach, you might want to avoid it. People falling into the sausage machinery, things like that. Leaves of Grass, the great American poem. I wrote about that. On Christian doctrine, Augustine. It's really on Christian teaching, to be a better translation. And he talks a lot about how to teach Christianity. And again, it's part of our heritage as Christians, and it's great to know this. So, well, that's Omnibus. And again, just seeing it, we'll give you kind of a guide, and I'll suggest some things you can do to Lutheranize it. And but a lot of what I said can go for any other kind of curriculum, much of which not necessarily going to be written by Lutherans, but it's very easily adaptable to our perspective. Okay. I'm a little bit over. If you have any questions, I'll let you go. If you have any questions, come up here and I'll be glad to talk to you about them. All right. Thank you.